There's a moment just after the worst of a hurricane passes when people believe the danger is over. They step outside, they survey the wreckage in their yards, they check on their neighbors. In Hawaii, on the morning of Sunday, August the 17th, 2026, tens of thousands of people woke up believing exactly that Hurricane Lala had come and gone, that the worst was behind them. They were wrong, because what Lala left behind was not merely debris. It was a state of cascading failure. 88,000 homes without electricity, roads severed by landslides, rivers still swelling hours after the rain should have stopped, and a moisture tail stretching hundreds of miles back across the Pacific, feeding band after band of fresh rainfall into mountains already saturated beyond their capacity. The storm had weakened. The danger had not. To understand what Hawaii is facing now, you need to understand what happened in the 48 hours before. Hurricane Lala strengthened from a disorganized tropical storm into a Category 1 hurricane in roughly 36 hours, driven by sea surface temperatures between 80.6 and 82.4 degrees Fahrenheit, well above the 79-degree threshold needed to sustain rapid intensification. The fuel source was a strengthening El Niño, one that forecasters said had a 69% chance of exceeding every post-1950 event on record. By Saturday, August the 15th, Lala's eye wall grazed the southern tip of the Big Island. Maximum sustained winds reached 75 miles per hour. A weather station at the summit of Mauna Kea, 13,803 feet above sea level, recorded a gust of 140 miles per hour. Lower elevations saw sustained winds between 70 and 80 miles per hour. On Maui, gusts topped 80 miles per hour across West Maui for much of the day. Even Oahu, more than 200 miles from the storm's center, felt the damage. But Lala's most destructive weapon was not wind. It was water. The community of Lapahoho, on the Hamakua coast of the Big Island, received more than 33 inches of rain between Friday and Sunday morning. At its worst, rain fell at a rate of 3 to 5 inches per hour. The Nahuku weather station recorded 16.18 inches, Glenwood approximately 12 inches, and Pihonua more than 10. This was not simply heavy rain. This was the orographic amplification of an already extreme moisture system. As Lala's bands drove westward, they collided with the massive flanks of Mauna Kea and Mauna Loa, each summit rising roughly 14,000 feet above the ocean. Warm, saturated air had no choice but to ascend, cool, and release its moisture in a sustained deluge that the terrain could not absorb. The Wailuku River rose from 3.4 feet to 16.2 feet, nearly 5 times its normal level. In Nalahu, 2 homes were swept entirely off their foundations by floodwater. The National Weather Service issued a life-threatening flash flood emergency for the communities of Nalahu, Pahala, and Hawaiian Ocean View. Rain was falling so fast that the ground could not absorb it. Drainage systems were overwhelmed, and entire subdivisions were transformed into shallow brown lakes. 1 person was killed in a storm-related car crash on Saturday, as Lala made its closest approach. But the greater danger was only just beginning to reveal itself. By 7 o'clock on Saturday evening, 88,000 customers across the Hawaiian Islands had lost power. On Hawaii Island alone, 63,270 customers were in the dark, including the entire east side and south side of the island, plus the communities of Waimea and Honoka'a. On Maui, approximately 15,260 customers lost electricity, including all of West Maui. On Oahu, roughly 9,500 customers went dark in neighborhoods, including Aina Haina, Ewa Beach, Kaimuki, Kalihi, Manoa, and Nuanu. The cause of the most devastating outages was not a single dramatic failure. It was a cascading series of failures caused by wind-toppled trees, many of them invasive albizia trees and ironwoods, falling across power lines and snapping utility poles one after another. On the Hamakua coast, this process destroyed multiple poles and structures along a 42-mile span of transmission lines. Repairing that corridor alone would require inspections across mountainous off-road terrain once weather conditions allowed. Hawaiian Electric spokesperson Darren Pai described the challenge in stark terms. Assessing damage along transmission lines can be quite intensive, he said, because those lines often run through rural areas and mountainous terrain. More than 500 Hawaiian Electric employees and support workers were on duty, but the storm itself made restoration work impossible. For the safety of crews and the public, all restoration work had to halt when conditions became too dangerous. On Hawaii Island, the County Civil Defense Agency asked crews to stay off roads entirely. This is the dangerous surprise Lala left behind. Not the storm itself. The storm was weakening, but the infrastructure it destroyed cannot be rebuilt in hours. It cannot even be assessed in hours. Customers on Hawaii Island and Maui were told to prepare for extended overnight outages. Mutual assistance crews from other utilities were not expected to arrive until Tuesday, 3 full days after the storm's peak. Unlike the continental United States, Hawaii cannot draw power from neighboring states. Each island operates its own isolated electrical grid. and there is no undersea cable connecting the Big Island to Maui or Maui to Oahu. When a transmission line fails on the Hamakua coast, the electrons have nowhere else to come from. There is no backup network of interconnected plants spanning 1,000 miles. There is only what exists on that single island. This geographic isolation means that every hurricane, every storm, every major weather event carries an amplified risk. On the mainland, when a utility loses a transmission corridor, power can be rerouted through alternative pathways across state lines. In Hawaii, when that corridor fails, entire communities are simply without power until physical repairs are complete. It also means that mutual assistance, the common practice of sending line crews from unaffected utilities to help restore power after a storm, requires those crews to fly thousands of miles across the Pacific Ocean, bringing their equipment with them. Hawaiian Electric was part of the Western Region Mutual Assistance Group and had arranged for mainland crews to arrive. But the logistics of deploying workers and heavy equipment to remote Pacific islands means days of delay that simply do not exist in mainland disaster response. While the power grid was collapsing, the road network was failing simultaneously. Highway 11, the main artery connecting the east and west sides of the Big Island, was closed at multiple points due to flooding and debris. Kohala Mountain Road was impassable. The Hawaii Belt Road was blocked near Marker 28. Old Volcano Road was closed. But the most dangerous post-storm hazard was the combination of saturated hillsides and continued rainfall. The mountains of the Big Island are composed of volcanic rock overlaid with relatively thin layers of soil. When that soil absorbs more water than it can hold, when saturation reaches 100%, the entire layer can release from the rock beneath it and slide downhill as a mudslide or debris flow. Lala's 33 inches of rain in less than 48 hours pushed much of the Big Island's terrain past that threshold. Every subsequent rain band that swept across the island, and there were many because Lala's moisture tail continued to feed storms for at least 2 more days, increased the probability of catastrophic landslides. The National Weather Service and Hawaii Emergency Management Agency warned that flash flooding and landslides were by far the biggest danger remaining from the storm, a danger that would persist well after the wind died down and the hurricane warning was replaced by a tropical storm warning. Governor Josh Green had signed an emergency proclamation ahead of the storm, activating a $100 million disaster fund and deploying 180 National Guard members across the state. Schools and state education offices were closed across Hawaii Island, Maui, Lanai, and Molokai. More than 200 flights were canceled. Norwegian Cruise Line diverted itineraries. But for the most vulnerable residents of the islands, no amount of institutional response could fully address their reality. Approximately 130 people sheltered in official emergency facilities. But many of the state's roughly 9,500 homeless individuals, a disproportionate number of whom live on the Big Island, had nowhere to go. In Hilo, outreach workers tried to convince encampment residents to evacuate before the storm. Some refused. Some moved to a Salvation Army tent shelter that held roughly 70 people. But tents are not hurricane shelters. When wind gusts exceed 60 miles per hour, a tent provides almost no protection. And when floodwaters rise, a tent on low ground becomes a trap. The aftermath of Lala exposed what was already known but rarely discussed. Hawaii's homeless population is disproportionately exposed to climate risk, and the state's shelter capacity is insufficient for a major weather event. Hawaii imports approximately 90% of its food from the mainland. That food arrives by cargo ship to harbors that close during the storm. It moves to stores by trucks that drive on highways that were severed by flooding and debris. The closure of both Hilo and Kona airports disrupted not only passenger travel, but also air freight, including fresh produce, medical supplies, and emergency equipment. Harbor closures delayed container ships carrying everything from canned goods to gasoline. Even after ports reopened, the backlog of delayed shipments meant grocery stores faced empty shelves for days. This is the cascading vulnerability that a single Category 1 hurricane exposed. Not a Category 5, not a direct hit. A glancing blow from a storm with 75-mile-per-hour winds, barely above the hurricane threshold, was sufficient to isolate the most isolated state in the Union from its food supply. Lala was the first hurricane to directly threaten the Big Island since 1871, a gap of 155 years. That statistical luck obscured a growing reality. 3 of the 5 closest hurricane approaches to Hawaii in the last 67 years occurred since 2014. Climate models published in 2016 predicted rising hurricane frequency near the Hawaiian Islands as sea surface temperatures climb. The mechanism is straightforward. Warmer oceans provide more energy for intensification, and El Niño patterns, which suppress wind shear and extend warm water zones toward Hawaii, are expected to become more frequent and intense as the planet warms. The 2026 El Niño was already the strongest in at least a decade. If it continues to intensify, The remainder of the hurricane season, which runs through November, could bring additional threats to the islands. Hawaiian Electric and state emergency managers will spend the coming weeks repairing the damage Lala caused. But the harder question, the one that Lala forced into the open, is whether Hawaii's fragile, isolated infrastructure can survive in a future where storms like this become routine. On Sunday morning, as dawn broke over the Big Island, the wind had dropped to tropical storm force. The eye had moved west. Weather models showed Lala continuing to weaken as it tracked away from the islands. But 88,000 homes were still dark. 33 inches of water had saturated hillsides that had never been tested like this. Roads remained impassable. The moisture tail was still feeding rain into the mountains. Hawaii was not safe yet. The storm had passed. The surprise had not.